The dog had already put 2 men in the infirmary that week, and nobody thought the woman walking through the gate was going to be the one to stop him. She came in carrying a worn canvas bag over one shoulder and a paper cup of coffee in her other hand, like she was heading to a morning briefing, instead of a military working dog compound where a 78-pound Belgian Malinois had just been put on the euthanasia list. She didn't rush. She didn't look nervous. She stopped just inside the gate, tilted her head slightly, and listened to the sound of Ghost slamming himself against the kennel walls 40 yards away. The 2 men watching her from under the shade of the equipment bay didn't bother hiding what they were thinking. "That her?" Staff Sergeant Thomas Briley said. Chief Warrant Officer Dale Ennis didn't answer. He just watched her. Her name was Juno Rask. 29 years old. She had a contractor badge clipped to the strap of her bag and a braid down the back of her head, and no rank on anything she was wearing. She worked for a civilian animal behavior consultancy out of San Diego that the Navy had apparently contracted for what the paperwork called behavioral rehabilitation assessment. What that meant, in practical terms, was that someone in the chain of command had decided to spend taxpayer money sending a woman with a coffee cup to look at a dog that had already been signed off for termination. Ennis had seen the authorization come through that morning. He'd read it twice. Then he'd forwarded it to Commander Aldis with a single line. "Is this serious?" Aldis hadn't responded. Ghost slammed against the kennel wall again, and the sound carried across the entire yard. Several of the handlers near the training decks turned their heads without meaning to. It was that kind of sound, the kind that reminded you what these animals were actually built to do. Juno Rask set her coffee down on top of a fence post and unzipped her bag. "I'm going to need the intake file," she said. Not loudly, not to anyone in particular. Briley looked at Ennis. Ennis looked at the woman. "You got credentials beyond that badge," he said. She glanced at him. She had dark eyes and a way of looking at people like she was already several steps ahead of whatever they were about to say. "I sent them to your administrative office 3 days ago," she said. "Dr. Meriden co-signed the authorization. If you need a second look, I can wait while you call him." Nobody called Dr. Meriden. Briley brought the file. She took it without sitting down, flipped through it standing, and didn't say anything for almost 2 full minutes. Ghost hit the wall again. She didn't flinch. Briley noticed that specifically, that she didn't flinch, because everyone else on the compound had started doing it automatically, the way you blink when someone raises their hand near your face. You stopped noticing you were doing it. She never started. "How long since his last successful mission deployment?" she said. 6 weeks, Ennis said. "And the incident with Corporal," she checked the file, "Whalen. 4 weeks ago. Then Sergeant Tran 2 weeks after that. Both bites. Both initiated on approach. No warning, no vocalization. Just," Ennis stopped. "You want to hear this? Go talk to Whelan. He's still in physical therapy." Junot nodded slowly. She closed the file and looked toward the kennel. "Who was his handler?" she said. Ennis went quiet. Briley looked at his boots. "Chief," she said. "Lieutenant Darren Foss," Ennis said finally. "Killed in action. 11 weeks ago. That's classified beyond what's in the file." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 11 weeks. That's what I said. And Ghost has been in that kennel for how much of those 11 weeks? Ennis didn't answer right away. He didn't love where this was going. "Most of it," he admitted. She looked at the kennel for another few seconds. Then she picked up her coffee, took a sip, and said, "I want to go in." The silence that followed was the kind that has a shape to it. "Into the kennel," Briley said. "Yes, with Ghost. That is typically what go in means." Briley exhaled through his nose. Ennis crossed his arms. Neither of them moved. "Ma'am," Ennis said, "that dog nearly took Tran's arm off at the elbow. He's 89 pounds of drive with nothing to direct it at, and he hasn't had a positive social interaction with a human being in over 2 months. We have a vet authorization too." "I read the authorization," she said. I have a counter-authorization from the same veterinary office. It's in the file. Ennis looked at Briley. Briley looked at Ennis. She waited. You got a bite suit? Briley said finally. I'm not going to need one. That was when Ennis laughed. Not a mean laugh, exactly. More the laugh of a man who had been in military working dog operations for 14 years and had watched a lot of people with clipboards and consultancy badges come through and say things that didn't survive contact with reality. With respect, he said, every person who's gone near that animal in the last 3 weeks has needed significantly more than a bite suit. I know, she said. Then, I know, she said again. I'm still going in. She was already walking toward the kennel. Ennis caught up with her in 6 strides. I cannot authorize this without a suit. Liability alone. Get me a suit if it makes you feel better, she said. But you need to understand that the suit changes my movement, and my movement is the only tool I have in there. So if I put it on, I'm less safe, not more. You can note that I declined it. I'll sign whatever you need. She stopped at the kennel gate. Ghost heard her coming before she got there. The slamming stopped. There was a different sound now, low, sustained. The kind of warning that lived somewhere below language, the sound of something deciding. 3 of the handlers who'd been working the far decks had drifted closer. They weren't rushing. They were just closer than they'd been. Ennis stood at the gate with his hand on the latch and did not open it. Chief, she said quietly. Give me one reason, he said. One reason I should open this gate. She looked at him. Something shifted in her face, not softness exactly, but something adjacent to it, something real. Because he's not broken, she said. He's waiting. Ennis stared at her for a long moment. Then he opened the gate. Ghost was against the back wall when she stepped in. She could see him. All muscle and stillness, the kind of stillness that was actually the opposite of stillness, that was energy being held by a single thread. His eyes tracked her the way a scope tracks a target. She didn't stop moving. She didn't speed up. She walked in at the same pace she'd been walking all morning, and she stopped about 12 feet from him and stood there. She didn't crouch. She didn't extend her hand. She didn't make any of the soft sounds people make when they're trying to calm an animal, and mostly trying to calm themselves. She just stood there. Ghost showed his teeth. She waited. Behind her, through the chain link, she was aware of Ennis and Briley, and now 4 or 5 others watching from the fence line. She didn't look back at them. She kept her eyes slightly off Ghost's face. Not a stare, not avoidance, just the particular angle that meant something specific in the language she was speaking right now. Ghost took a step toward her. She didn't move. He took 2 more. He was 6 feet away now, and his posture was everything that word threat is trying to be when it grows up. His hackles were up. His weight was forward. His ears were flat. One of the handlers at the fence said something under his breath, and Briley told him to be quiet. Ghost stopped. He stood there with his muzzle 2 feet from her hip and his body vibrating with something she could only call grief, because that was what it was, even if nobody here had been willing to call it that. Even if the paperwork called it behavioral dysregulation secondary to handler loss, and the vet tech called it liability, and Dale Ennis called it a dog that needs to be put down before someone gets killed. She called it grief. She said one word. It was in check. Foss had trained him in check. It was in the file, buried in the appendix, the kind of detail people skim past, a single command that didn't mean stop or sit or heal. It was an old-school Schutzhund word that roughly translated to something between rest and I'm here. Ghost went still, not the aggressive stillness. The other kind. The kind that happens when something that has been wound tight for weeks suddenly finds the one thread it recognizes. He sat down, not because she forced him, not because he was afraid of her, because she spoke to him in the language his whole life had been built around. And for the first time in 11 weeks, someone had spoken to him at all. Behind the fence, nobody said anything. Juno Rask lowered herself slowly to one knee, still not reaching out, still letting him decide. Ghost looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her the way dogs do when they're reading something beyond the surface. Then he moved forward, slow and deliberate, and he put his head against her shoulder. She put her hand on the back of his neck. Dale Ennis, 14 years in military working dog operations, looked away. She stayed in the kennel for 2 hours that first day. Nobody interrupted her. When she came out, she walked back to where Ennis was standing and said, "He needs 4 weeks. Structured reintegration, gradual reintroduction to operational tasks, and someone to run him in the mornings who isn't afraid of him. I'll be here every day." Ennis stared at her. "We have a deployment window in 3 weeks. Then we have 3 weeks," she said. "That's not possible. I'll need access to the training decks from 0500. I'll need the intake vet to consult with me twice a week. And I need you to stop sending people in there who are scared because he can tell, and it confirms everything he's been learning for the last 2 months, which is that the people coming to him aren't safe, AVM's Rask. It's Juno, and I know this isn't what you were expecting when you read that authorization this morning." She met his eyes. "I also know you forwarded it to Commander Aldis with a question about whether it was serious. He didn't answer you." Ennis went still. "How do you?" "Because Aldis called Dr. Meriden before he called me," she said. "And Dr. Meriden called me. That's how this works." She picked up her canvas bag and walked toward the parking area. Briley watched her go. Then he looked at Ennis. "You think she can do it?" Ennis looked at the kennel, where Ghost had, for the first time in weeks, stopped throwing himself against the walls. He was lying down. His chin was on his paws. "I think," Ennis said slowly, "that I don't know what I think." She was back at 0510 the next morning. The compound was still dark when she arrived. The night duty handler, a young specialist named Cord Weathers, who looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days, watched her sign in with the gate guard and walk straight to the kennel block without stopping to explain herself to anyone. She ran Ghost for 45 minutes in the east yard, in the dark, and Weathers watched through the chain-link fence with the careful attention of someone who can't decide if what they're seeing is impressive or insane. Ghost moved differently. Not fully. He wasn't the dog he'd been before, not yet, but the wild, undirected energy had a shape to it now. She was giving it something to run into. She didn't use a leash. She gave commands in check. Ghost followed them with the precision of an animal remembering who it is. By the time the early crew arrived at 0600, she was running him through a modified obstacle course, and 3 handlers had gathered without really meaning to, coffee in hand, watching. Briley found Ennis in the break room at 0630. "She's on the east deck," Briley said. "I know. Ghost just cleared the balance rail. I know. Chief, 2 days ago that dog wouldn't let anyone within. I know, Briley." Ennis stared at his coffee. He'd been in this building since 0430. He'd been thinking about the Fossey file, which he'd pulled again last night, and read more carefully than he had when it first crossed his desk. Darren Fossey, 31 years old, killed in a non-disclosed operational theater 11 weeks ago. Ghost had been his dog for 4 years. 4 years was longer than most handler-dog pairings lasted. 4 years was a long time to build a language between 2 living things. When Foss died, nobody had called Juno Rask. That wasn't in the file, but he was starting to understand it anyway. The conversation with Commander Aldis happened at the end of that first week. Aldis was a compact man in his early 50s, with the particular economy of movement that came from spending decades making decisions under pressure. He didn't waste words. He didn't ask how things were going. He looked at the report Ennis had put on his desk and read it in silence for 2 minutes. 70% drive restoration in 6 days, he said. "Correct. That's..." Aldis stopped. "Yes, sir." Aldis looked up from the report. "She trained with Foss." Ennis had not put that in the report. It wasn't in any file he'd been given access to. But he'd asked around, in the careful way you ask around sibs that live in the classified margins. He'd made 2 calls. He'd gotten 2 non-answers that told him more than answers would have. "I believe so," Ennis said. Ghost's earliest training records reference a civilian behavioral specialist on a ghost contract. Those records are redacted above my clearance level. The check command set wasn't standard. Foss had it built in from the beginning. Someone built it. Aldis was quiet. She knew exactly where in the file the language commands were, Ennis said. She went straight to the appendix. She didn't read anything else first. Aldis looked at the report again. "She say anything to you about Foss?" "No, sir." "You ask?" "Once." "What'd she say?" Ennis thought about that for a moment. Thought about her face when he'd asked carefully whether she'd known Lieutenant Foss personally, the way she hadn't looked away, the way she'd said, "Ghost knows who I am." That's what matters right now. "She redirected," he said. Aldis set the report down. He looked out the window at the east deck, where Ghost was currently running a tracking exercise with the focus of an animal that had remembered its purpose. "Don't push her on it," Aldis said. "No, sir. And Ennis, that call I didn't return, when you forwarded the authorization. Sir, I should have. It wasn't an apology, exactly. It was something more useful than an apology. She came recommended by someone I trust," Aldis said. "Someone who knew Foss. I should have told you that instead of leaving you to figure it out." Ennis nodded. "She gets whatever she needs," Aldis said. "Whatever the timeline looks like. We push the deployment window if we have to, yes, sir." On day 9, she told Ennis what she actually was. She didn't sit down to tell him. They were standing at the fence watching ghost work through a building clearance simulation with Weathers. Weathers, who had been chosen carefully, who was calm and consistent and had the kind of quiet nerve that animals read as safe. Ghost had accepted him with the focused tolerance of a professional returning to a job after a long injury. "I met Darren when I was 23, she said. Not preamble, just the sentence. I was finishing my master's in animal behavior and cognition at UC Davis. He was at a seminar I presented at. He had questions afterward that were better than most of the questions I'd ever gotten from academic reviewers." Ennis didn't say anything. He was working a dog at the time, not Ghost, a shepherd named Bauer, and he had a problem he couldn't solve. Something behavioral, something nobody on his team understood. A colleague of his gave him my name. We worked together for about 8 months on the phone and email. Bauer ended up being one of the best operational dogs in his unit. "And Ghost," Ennis said. "Ghost came later. Darren was starting with a new dog. Younger, more drive, more complex. He wanted to build the foundation differently this time. He asked me to come consult in person. That was 4.5 years ago." She paused. "I spent 3 months with Ghost when he was 14 months old. We built the check set together, Darren and I. Ghost's entire foundational training ran through that framework." "Why check?" She almost smiled. "Darren's grandmother was check. He liked the sound of it, and there's a certain operational advantage to commands that aren't in any language your typical adversary would expect." She watched Ghost move through a doorway with the precision of something beautiful. "When they told me Darren was gone, they didn't tell me. That's the thing. I found out the same way. I found out Ghost was on the euthanasia list. Someone on the outside, someone who knew Darren and knew me, made a call they weren't supposed to make." Ennis stood with that for a moment. The authorization paperwork came down pretty fast once it was initiated. "Because Aldis signed it in 6 hours, she said. "I've been trying to get someone to listen for 3 weeks. The right person finally listened. Weathers called a command. Ghost hit his mark. Perfect. Weathers didn't react the way most of the team would have, with surprise or relief. He just nodded, like this was expected, like this was what they'd been building toward. "He's good," Juno said, meaning Weathers. "Yeah," Ennis agreed. "He is. He should be Ghost's primary handler. When I'm not here, you plan on not being here." She was quiet for a moment. Something passed across her face that she didn't try to hide, but also didn't explain. "I have other work," she said finally. "This was never supposed to be my long-term assignment. I came because Ghost needed someone who could reach him, and I was the only one who could. Once he's stable, once he trusts Weathers, he doesn't need me specifically anymore. That's a generous way to look at it. It's practical, she said. But her voice didn't sound purely practical. The deployment evaluation came at day 19. Command had sent an assessment team. 2 people from the dog program office, a behavioral vet Ennis had never met named Dr. Cheryl Oakes, and a senior NCO who ran the working dog evaluations for the East Coast facilities. They arrived with clipboards and a structured evaluation protocol, and the particular skepticism of people who had read a report that said something they didn't fully believe. Ghost ran the evaluation clean. Not mostly clean. Not passing with reservations clean. He ran it the way he'd run it before Foss died, with the full, focused, controlled ferocity of an elite working dog who remembered exactly what he was trained to do. He hit every mark. He ran every scenario. When the evaluator's assistant, a stranger Ghost had never met, approached him in a controlled provocation scenario, Ghost held position until the command came to release, and then he did what he was trained to do, and when the next command came, he stopped. No hesitation, no bleed-through, command and response, precise as machinery, alive as something that was absolutely not machinery. Dr. Oakes stood at the evaluation fence and watched and didn't say anything for a long time. "Who ran the reintegration?" she said finally. "Civilian contractor," the NCO said. "Behavioral specialist." "Which protocol?" "Hers," Ennis said. "She developed it for this specific case." Oakes looked at him. "Ghost's situation was specific," Ennis said. "The standard protocols weren't designed for what was happening with him." And what was happening with him? Ennis thought about Juno's face when she'd said it that first day. The certainty in it. The way she'd said it like she was correcting a mathematical error rather than contradicting a room full of people with more rank and more years than her. "He wasn't broken," Ennis said. "He was grieving." She was on the east deck when he found her after the evaluation, running Ghost through a wind-down sequence, low intensity, rhythmic, the kind of thing that brought a working dog from operational readiness back into something like rest. It was as deliberate as everything else she did. "They're approving full deployment status," he said. She nodded. She didn't stop the sequence. "Dr. Oakes wants to write up the reintegration for the program office." "She can have the notes," Juno said. "The protocol isn't proprietary." Ghost circled back to her and sat, and she crouched down and put both hands on his face for a moment, just held him there, the way you hold something you've been worried about. Then she stood up and gave a soft release command, and he went to the water station. "He's going to be okay," Ennis said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "He is. You could stay," he said. "I know that's not. I know." She picked up her bag. "Weathers has everything he needs. The documentation is complete. Ghost will tell him the rest." Ennis nodded. He looked at the dog, who was drinking water in the afternoon light, with the satisfied practicality of an animal that had done good work and knew it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask. Why didn't you tell us who you were? When you first came in, you could have led with the history. Would have made everything a lot easier." She considered that for a moment. Not like she hadn't thought about it, more like she was deciding what the true answer was versus the easy one. "Because it wouldn't have mattered," she said. "Not at first. You would have heard civilian contractor and personal relationship with the deceased handler, and you would have thought I was compromised, too emotional, too invested." She looked at him. "The only thing that was going to matter was whether I could do what I came here to do, so I went in and did it, and then the rest was already answered." Ennis stood with that. "Besides," she said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one, "you almost opened the gate pretty quickly once I asked." "Almost is doing a lot of work in that sentence," he said. She did smile, then, briefly. 14 seconds, she said. I counted. She left on a Thursday morning, before the compound was fully awake. Weathers was running Ghost on the east deck when she stopped to watch for a few minutes, quiet, standing at the fence the way she'd stood at that first fence 19 days ago. Ghost was working a tracking sequence, nose low, purpose in every movement. He was different from the animal that had been slamming himself against kennel walls the week she arrived. Not because anything had been fixed or corrected or repaired, because someone had finally understood what he was saying. Weathers looked up and saw her at the fence. He raised a hand, she raised hers back. Ghost lifted his head and found her with his eyes across the yard. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said quietly, too quietly for Weathers to hear, too quietly for anyone to hear. Ghost held it for a beat. Then his tail moved once, slow and deliberate. Then he put his nose back to the ground and kept working. Juno Rask picked up her bag and walked to her car and drove out through the gate, and the compound went on around her absence the way compounds do, full of noise and purpose and dogs and people doing their jobs. And somewhere on the east deck, a dog that had been written off as finished ran a perfect track in the early morning light and was not finished at all.